This hearing will come to order. I want to welcome Secretary Nielsen. Thank you for your service. I did read your press release on National Police Week, and I think it is fitting and proper that we pay tribute to law enforcement officers killed in action and just really honor the families for their service as well. According to the National Law Enforcement Officer Memorial Fund, since 1791, 21,541 law enforcement officials have paid the ultimate price, sacrificed their lives. Last year, 129. Year-to-date this year, 53. So I think it'd be fitting and proper if we just recognize a moment of silence to honor those and their families. Thank you. I would ask you to consent that my written opening statement be entered in the record. The title of this hearing is Authorities and Resources Needed to Protect and Secure the United States. And I know, Secretary Nielsen, you've testified before the Appropriation Committee, so obviously the senators can ask any questions they want. But from my standpoint, because we are the authorizing committee, I really want to concentrate on the authorities part of that hearing title. And, you know, I'd just kind of like to go down the list of things that are certainly on my mind, and hopefully yours as well. But I think this committee did a very good job. That we're kind of known for a very bipartisan, nonpartisan approach to trying to find areas of agreement. And we did exactly that with the DHS Authorization Act, which I am hoping we can pass through the Senate as quickly as possible, marry up with a House bill to provide you the authorities that have basically become obsolete in many cases. I know in the omnibus, Section 782, the flexibility of reorganizing parts of your department was actually taken away, which is important when we take a look at NPPD, turning that into the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Act, or agency. These are the things that you need to do your job to keep this nation safe. In cooperation with your department, we're working with a number of members. I see two of them that are co-sponsors right now to the Preventing Emerging Threats Act of 2018, which a big part of that is really addressing countering unmanned aircraft systems, which is a growing threat. It's a real threat, and it's confusing. They're conflicting authorities, no authorities from your standpoint in terms of addressing those, being able to take those out of the air. And again, it's a complex situation. And of course, I think it's just crucial that we fix our completely broken immigration system. The fact that we have laws, legal precedent, loopholes, that because you follow the law, really prevent you from deterring additional illegal immigration. A classic example of how that would actually work was in 2005, under Secretary Chertoff, we had a flow of illegal immigrants coming in from Brazil because they had a visa waiver system with Mexico. So we had over 30,000 Brazilians come in 2005, and Secretary Chertoff, by utilizing his authorities, apprehended, I think they called the program Texas Hold'em, apprehended those Brazilians, held them in detention until their case could be adjudicated, and then returned them. By the following year, less than 2,000 Brazilians came in here. So the goal of his actions were to reduce, if not stop, the flow, as opposed to, you know, right now we've got to, unfortunately, you are forced to apprehend, process, and disperse, and that is a huge incentive for additional illegal immigration. So those are the types of authorities that I want to hopefully discuss during this committee. Those are the types of authorities I want to provide you as Secretary of Homeland Security so you can actually fulfill your mission of providing greater security for our homeland. So with that, I'll turn it over to my ranking member, Senator McCaskill.
Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Nielsen, for being here. I'd like to talk about DHS's budget and authorities and policies in two important areas today, and one is on the border as it relates to Border Patrol staffing. I am concerned about Border Patrol staffing. I think the men and women of the Border Patrol do an amazing job. I think they are brave and courageous and hardworking, and this is Law Enforcement Week in Washington, and I think it's important to recognize all of the men and women in uniform across this country who protect us. But it's interesting because when you look at the staffing along the border, the diagram of the staffing, it has been on a downward trajectory since President Trump took office. In September of 2016, there were 19,828 Border Patrol agents along the borders. And in April of 2018, it's actually down 400 and some staff. And that is in spite of the fact that there is an authorization for many more, as you are painfully aware of, I'm sure. We have an authorization for 21,370. So we're, hundreds and hundreds lower than we were when President Trump took office, and we are many more under for what are authorized. And we keep debating additional authorizations as if that's somehow going to solve the problem. And we've talked about this in various hearings, and I know everyone wants to point it to the polygraph, but it doesn't seem reasonable to me that that is the only reason. You can't keep up with attrition right now. You can't hire, and we've got some outrageous, I think, contracts for recruitment. One of the things I want to talk about today is, are we missing the boat here in terms of improving pay and working conditions? I mean, many times people leave a job because they don't feel that they are getting adequate pay, or they're not being asked to perform in ideal working conditions. And I know that it's impossible to make this work always ideal, because at law enforcement you have to take what comes. But there's a real problem that clearly we're not getting at. And that's one of the things I want to talk about today. The other things I want to talk about today is the difference between Border Patrol agents and Border Patrol officers. And I don't think most Americans understand that we use those terms, and for most people, they probably think they're the same thing. I don't know how that happened. I don't know how we named them that way, but it's terribly misleading because, of course, the officers are the ones that are at the port of entries. The agents are the ones along the border. And unlike the Border Patrol agents, we are not authorizing significantly new officers, even though it is very clear in a report I released from the minority staff of this committee analyzing what is happening. We found that 88% of all the opioids seized over the past 5 years were seized at ports of entry, not along the border. So close to 90% of what is being seized in terms of dangerous opioids is happening with our Border Patrol officers at ports, not along the border, not in the desert, not along the river, not as has been described sometimes by people in this administration, that this is a problem of people trying to enter illegally with drugs. That's actually coming in through the ports. And the fentanyl seizure increases on two fronts are in the ports of entry on the southern border and in mail facilities. And in both instances, you are also woefully understaffed. And so these are the two areas I want to talk about, where your staffing demands are clearly not being met, and we've got to figure out this problem. Because, people can give speeches and talk about, that we've got to, turn back illegal immigrants, and there are too many illegal immigrants coming across, and nobody is disagreeing with wanting to secure the border. But when you can't hire the people you need, and when the people you hire are leaving more quickly than you can hire replacements, there is a more fundamental problem here than just adding more personnel. And I'd like us to try to see if we could get to the bottom of that today. And I would ask that my written statement be made part of the record.
Without objection. It is the tradition of this committee to swear in witnesses, so if you'll stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you'll give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? You be seated. Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen is the sixth secretary for the Department of Homeland Security and the first former DHS employee to become the secretary. Prior to joining the department, Ms. Nielsen served as the Deputy Principal White House Chief of Staff to President Trump. Secretary Nielsen also served as the Chief of Staff to then Secretary John Kelly at the Department of Homeland Security. Secretary Nielsen served in the Bush administration as a special assistant to the President and senior director on the White House Homeland Security Council from 2004 to 2007. She holds a bachelor's degree from the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and a JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. Secretary Nielsen.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member McCaskill, and other distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today, and I'd like, if I could, to submit my full written testimony for the record.
Without objection.
I want to begin by thanking you. As the chairman mentioned, we greatly appreciate your advancing the DHS authorization bill earlier this year. As you know, we have not been reauthorized since our creation 15 years ago. This results in critical gaps that affect our ability to protect the American people. I also want to thank you in general and to the full committee for being strong supporters of DHS, for listening to our analysis of emerging threats, and listening to what we need to do our jobs. A lot has changed in 15 years. The threats have evolved, our enemies have adapted, and our adversaries are resurgent. In the meantime, our authorities have not kept pace. So today I want to highlight several areas where DHS requests your support in order to help us better secure our country, including achieving border security and closing immigration loopholes, transforming our cyber agency within DHS, authorizing the Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Office, providing authorities to help us counter unmanned aerial systems, and supporting the President's 2019 budget proposal for DHS. First and foremost, border security is national security. And while we have made vast improvements, make no mistake, we do face a crisis. We see unacceptable levels of illegal drugs, dangerous gangs, criminal activity, and illegal aliens flow across our southern border. That is why last month we deployed the National Guard to our southern border. Anyone who thinks this is a stunt should look at the stats. Our officers have apprehended more than 2,000 people attempting to illegally enter our country, and they are interdicting drugs that would likely otherwise have gone undetected. At the same time, my message to smugglers, traffickers, and criminals is clear. If you tried to enter our country without authorization, you've broken the law. The Attorney General has declared that we will have zero tolerance for all illegal border crossings, and I stand by that. Anyone crossing the border illegally or filing a fraudulent asylum claim will be detained, referred for criminal prosecution, and removed from the United States as appropriate. But our National Guard deployment, zero tolerance policy, border wall construction, and other actions will only get us partway there. We urgently need Congress to pass legislation to close the legal loopholes that are fueling this crisis in the first place. Those coming illegally know it's easier to get released into America if they claim asylum. They know it's easier to get released if they're part of a family or if they're unaccompanied children. So it should come as no surprise that we are seeing a spike in all of these categories. Word is getting out. Asylum claims are up 200% in the past 5 years. Family unit apprehensions are up nearly 600% compared to this time last year, and UAC apprehensions are up more than 300%. In fact, 5 years ago, apprehensions of families and UACs were less than 1 out of every 10 apprehensions. Now they approach almost half, 40%. Some say these increases are the result of spreading crime or failing economies in source countries. But in those places, we are actually seeing economic growth and lower homicide rates. The reality is that their economies are cratering. It's that the reality is not that their economies are cratering, it's that ours is booming. America is a land of opportunity. And that's a pull factor for anyone. But if we have a legal system of immigration for those who want to come here for economic reasons, they should do so legally. Asylum is for people fleeing persecution, not those searching for a better job. Yet our broken system, with its debilitating court rulings, a crushing backlog, and gaping loopholes, allows illegal migrants to get into our country anyway and for whatever reason they want. This gaming of the system is unacceptable. We need urgent action from Congress to close these dangerous legal loopholes that are making our country vulnerable. I would also note, and it's important, I try to say this at every opportunity, that the journey itself to our borders is risky. It endangers the illegal aliens themselves, the communities they pass through, our agents at the border, in U.S. communities, and our homeland. To be clear, Human smuggling operations are lining the pockets of transnational criminals. They are not humanitarian endeavors. Smugglers prioritize profits over people. And when aliens pay them to get here, they are contributing $500 million a year or more to groups that are fueling greater violence and instability in America and the region. There are other options. If migrants have a legitimate need to flee, they should seek protection in the first safe country they enter, including Mexico. They should not subject themselves to a long and dangerous journey. This is not and should not be a political or partisan issue, and I hope that we can discuss real solutions today. The past 4 presidents have pleaded with Congress to act on this security challenge, but this administration is tired of waiting. So in the meantime, we are doing everything within our authorities to secure the border and enforce our laws. Turning to the cyber domain, I want to make clear today that we've reached a turning point in cyber threat evolution, where digital security is converging with personal and physical security. Cybersecurity can no longer be relegated to the IT department and thought of as a nuisance. Now it's a matter of preserving our lives, our livelihoods, and our American way of life. One of the most critical parts of the DHS authorization bill is its evolution of our cybersecurity and infrastructure security resilience mission, transforming the National Protection and Programs Division, NPPD, into a new operational component, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, is imperative to our success on the front lines of the digital battlefield. It will be a clearer focal point for our interagency, industry, and international partners. It will help DHS recruit and retain employees with critical skill sets, and it will clarify DHS's role as National Risk Manager for cybersecurity and critical infrastructure security. I ask and thank for the committee's continued support in the transformation of this component. I also want to take this opportunity to mention the department's cybersecurity strategy, which is being rolled out today. The strategy is built on the concepts of mitigating systemic risk and strengthening collective defense. Both will inform our approach to defending U.S. networks and supporting governments at all levels in the private sector in increasing the security and resilience of critical infrastructure. I do look forward to discussing that with you further today. I am also seeking your support to confront another category of evolving threats, weapons of mass destruction. From the chemical attacks in Syria to Russia's brazen assassination attempt against a UK defector, we have seen the damage that these agents can do. And we know that terrorists are not only using them on the battlefield, but are working to incorporate them into Western attacks. In December, I announced the establishment of a DHS Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Office, which is now leading our response to these threat streams and incidents. But the office still lacks critical authorities. While we currently have the ability to respond comprehensively to nuclear threats, we lack comparable authorities for chemical and biological threats. I ask this committee and all of Congress to work with me to permanently authorize this office and to equalize the authorities we possess across all threat vectors. Further, our enemies are exploring other technologies as well, such as drones, to put our country in danger. ISIS has used armed drones to strike targets in Syria, and we are increasingly concerned that it will try the same tactics on our soil. We have also seen drones used to smuggle drugs across our borders and to conduct surveillance on sensitive government locations. So today, I'd like to particularly thank Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member McCaskill, Senator Heitkamp, and Senator Hoeven for responding to our request and introducing a bill to help DHS counter the growing threat posed by UAS. DHS needs clear legal authority to identify, track, and mitigate drones that could pose a danger to the public and to DHS operations. Our proposal, and your bill, would authorize DHS and the Department of Justice to conduct limited counter-UAS operations for a narrow set of important and prioritized missions, all the while importantly protecting privacy and civil liberties. We are grateful for your leadership on this and look forward to working with you as the legislation moves forward. Finally, I would like to ask for the committee's support for the President's 2019 budget. The budget for DHS requests $47.5 billion in net discretionary funding and an additional $6.7 billion for the Disaster Relief Fund for response and recovery to major disasters. This budget sustains and strengthens our most critical programs and capabilities. It emphasizes protecting our nation from terrorism and countering threats, securing and managing our borders, enforcing our immigration laws, preserving and upholding the nation's prosperity and economic security, securing cyberspace and critical infrastructure, and strengthening Homeland Security preparedness and resilience. Throughout all of these missions, the budget also prioritizes my goal of putting our dedicated employees first and maturing DHS operations. I ask the committee to support this budget, to continue supporting our employees and our missions, and to continue to help us make our country more secure. I thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Secretary Nielsen. Before I turn questioning over to Senator McCaskill, I do want to put up and draw everybody's attention to a couple charts. The first one is UAC apprehensions. The reason I'm doing this is to make the point that regardless of what a particular law says, we within our laws, our precedents, our legal loopholes, create incentives for people to come to this country illegally. I think the first example was the deferred action on childhood admissions or arrivals. If you take a look at the number of children coming in here from Central America in 2009, 10, 11, 12, it was relatively minimal. And in June 2012, we had the deferred action on childhood arrivals, and you can see what happened afterwards. I don't have the figures year-to-date 2018, but I think we're on pace for an increase again over 2017. The next chart has 5.5 years of apprehension history at the border. And again, nothing's definitive. This isn't scientific, but it's pretty indicative that when President Trump came into office, obviously dedicated to securing our border, Secretary Kelly, I think, said all the right things in terms of being dedicated and giving CBP and ICE the authority to enforce the law. There was a dramatic drop in apprehensions, which indicates the number of people coming in illegally. Unfortunately, the reality of what our laws are has gotten into the fabric of people's consciousness, and the result being people realize that they can still go up to the border as an unaccompanied child. We apprehend them, we process them, we disperse them. We've only returned 3.5% of unaccompanied children from Central America, I believe if my numbers are right. And of course, we still have the issue of people walking up, claiming credible fear, and going through a similar type of process. Not showing up for their hearings, that type of thing. So that's the reality of our law. And so a deterrent factor worked for about a year, but until we actually change those laws, I think we're going to have a real tough time actually deterring illegal immigration. But with that, I'll turn it over to Senator McCaskill.
Well, first, I would not call the DACA recipients, the unaccompanied minors, apprehensions. The vast majority of the unaccompanied minors are walking across and saying, "Help us, please." I think apprehension is a weird word to use.
Well, that's precisely my point, though. They can just walk in and turn themselves in.
The second point I'd make is DACA was wiped off the books by this administration in March of this year. And since March, the number of people coming across the border has increased, not decreased. So DACA is gone. It is no longer the law. And we went from having 36,000 people apprehended at the border in February to 50,000 in March, and then almost to 51,000 in April. So if DACA was the magic thing that is causing this, it seems to me we'd see, and by the way, DACA doesn't even apply to these kids. None of them are qualified for DACA, none of them. So I think we've got problems securing our borders, and I don't want to argue about that because I think we all agree that we have to secure our borders. I want to focus in on this. Once again, in your opening statement, you talked about the drugs at the southern border. 90% of the opioids that are being seized at the ports of entry, correct, Secretary Nielsen?
I don't have that exact figure, but yes, the majority.
We do. We got it from you.
The majority of drugs that we see are coming through the ports of
entry. Like 90%. 85% of the fentanyl, which is killing all of our constituents every day, 85% of it is coming in through the ports, not across the southern border. So whenever this talking point that it's the people coming across the southern border that are bringing all the drugs, it's like fingernails on a blackboard because it's just not accurate. And here's the thing I don't get. There has been 0 requests for additional port officers, 0, last year or this year, to be used at these critical places. You did ask for 60 this year, but it was all for a training center.
not for actually deployment into these ports. And according to your own staffing studies, you are short by over 4,000 officers at these ports. Our citizens are dying from fentanyl every day. Our emergency rooms are overloaded. There isn't a week that goes by that I don't talk to a parent in Missouri who has lost a child to fentanyl overdose that's coming in this manner. Can you explain why we're continuing to ask for more agents along the border when we can't hire enough, but there's no requests for this critical need in our country?
Yes, Senator, first I'd just like to say it is a huge problem. It's one, as you know, that we take seriously, the full administration. Let me give you a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is it's not just the people at the ports. So what we have done is we've asked for additional technology. As you know, we have now trained canines at every port of entry to actually find the drugs. What we find is far and away, the best way to detect the drugs coming through the ports is through that non-intrusive technology and through canines. So we have increased that, and we continue to ask for additional resources. What we've also done, though, is taken the approach to try to push the borders out. So rather than waiting for the drugs to come here, we're working much more in a forward deployed fashion through JTTFs, through what we have in Key West, which, as you know, Jihad South is a multi-20, 30 country effort to identify and track the drugs before they ever reach our shores, before they ever reach the ports of entry. We also, you mentioned in your opening remarks, the vast increase in mail. We thank you for the Interdict Act. We're working with you on the STOP Act. We need to do more there, absolutely, because that's the other way that fentanyl is getting in. So we're trying to look at it as a system of systems. In other words, what are all the different interdiction points that we can best get after this? Another one we have asked for budget on are our cyber capabilities within ICE and Secret Service, because most of these drugs in marketplaces are on the dark web. So we've increased our capability to take them down, to track the TCOs to their source, and to turn off not only their market, but their ability to get the drugs. So yes, we have to continue to do more, but we're trying to do it in a layered approach, so it's a system approach.
Is there a good answer as to why there was 0 requests for additional port officers when you are 4,000 staff members under your staffing model, and yet there were 750 additional agents requested along the southern border, even though you can't even fill or the attrition that you're having now? Is there a good reason as to why there would be that dichotomy?
The good news I'll mention quickly is that the attrition's down, and we can talk more about hiring because I know that was a concern of yours in general. But happy to come in myself or have folks come and walk you through the model. The other part about drugs that I didn't mention is what we tend to see is the drugs themselves will be smuggled through the ports of entry. Again, we use the technology and canines, but the people, the actual TCO members who will then sell the drugs, come in between the ports of entry because they know if they come in at the port of entry, they'll be stopped. So it's we need to stop the people and the drugs. But in terms of the staffing model that you're discussing, I'm happy to come talk to you about it in detail.
Yeah, it doesn't, and if you look at your staffing at the United States in terms of mail facilities, it's even worse. I mean, you've got 17 officers covering 2 shifts in Cincinnati, screening almost 46 million import shipments in 1 year. I mean, that's just overwhelming. I just think somebody has got to get off the political speeches problem and be pragmatic. All of us want to support what you need along the border. But this notion that if we can just say, look over here, it's all about people coming across the border, and totally ignore the biggest public health crisis this country has ever faced by not adequately staffing the places where the drugs are coming in is just heartbreaking to me.
But ma'am, I'm not saying that. What I'm suggesting is that what we find is the best way to identify those drugs is through technology and canines, and that's what we're increasing.
But you have to have people to run both technology and canines.
We have to have
Every
people.
dog has a handler.
We have to have people
in fact,
as well.
more than one handler.
But there's no suggestion that we have a lack of people to work with the canines or run the machines. So again, happy to walk you through, but I do want to make clear we're attacking the opioid crisis from many, many levels with many capabilities.
I have questions about the air marshals, but I will hold those until the next round. Thank you, Secretary.
Senator Hoven.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson, and thank you, Secretary, for being here today and for the important work that you're doing every day. I'm going to follow up on some of the things we talked about at our DHS appropriation hearing, which you were at recently. I'm pleased to co-sponsor legislation with this committee's leadership that will give you authorities at DHS in regard to addressing some of the challenges with making sure that in our airspace we manage the UAS, unmanned aerial vehicles and systems adequately, not only to protect privacy but also security. That's very important work. And my first question is, while we're working with you to provide those authorities to track and disable threatening unmanned aircraft, and as you would develop these counter-UAS capabilities, do you have a plan in place to identify promising technologies from the private sector and get them validated by the department so that you can use them in this effort? And how will you go about testing and evaluating counter-UAS technologies?
Thank you. So we've learned quite a few lessons from the Department of Defense, which, as you know, has this authority already and uses it in theater. So we're looking at their testing models. The approach would absolutely be to go to the private sector. It often is at DHS. It doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel when something already exists that could fill a need. So we're specifying out the requirements, making sure we understand what it is we need to do, and then work in conjunction with the private sector. As you know, there's many centers of excellence, particularly those as well in your state. We're doing a lot of work there with the university as well, everything from intern programs to other capability building exercises to help get both the people and the technology.
So you hit the nail on the head there. That's where I'm going. We're working with you on a time to get you out this summer to see what we're doing in counter-UAS, not only from the military standpoint, but Customs and Border Protection, as well as the private sector. And as you develop that plan, we think we can be very helpful in terms of you seeing some of the things that are being done and then leveraging some of that technology development for DHS. When Secretary Mattis was in front of our Defense Appropriations Committee, we also talked about it in terms of the military, and in the same way, they're both seeking authority and developing some of these counter-UAS technologies. So we appreciate your willingness to engage in that, and we think it'll be very helpful and productive.
Well, thank you again for the bill.
You have an incredible ops center in California that is managing your unmanned aircraft along the border. And so I guess my question, does that Air and Marine Operations Center have sufficient capacity to handle all these far-flung UAS activities? And do you have backup? And so both capacity and backup, that's another, I guess, area that I know you're going to continue to develop and grow. And how's that going? Can we be of help there?
Yes, thank you. So as you say, the Ops Center in California allows us to deploy, to understand and track where we are using, and to help us with a model for when we need to use them, where we need to use them. At DHS, we're trying to use a task force unity of effort approach. So we borrow help, if you will, from other parts of DHS that either have the technical capability to fly and to have the flight hours to use the UAS, but also in terms of their models. As you know, we use UAS for a variety of things. We use them on the border, but we also use them for disaster response to understand, what it looked like before the hurricane, what it looked like after, to determine public assistance. So there's quite a few areas within DHS that we use it. We'll continue to use this center. As you mentioned, redundancy. What we are looking at, in addition to the underlying capability, is making sure that we do have that redundancy. That's sort of that next phase that we're in now.
There's an incredible pilot shortage both for manned and unmanned aircraft. And actually, I want to commend you and Commissioner McAleenan with Customs and Border Protection for developing the Pathways program, which we have at Grand Forks, which in essence provides jobs for young people that are getting their training in aviation at the University of North Dakota. So not only does CBP get a quality employee, great young person, and of course they need the manpower, as we've talked about, but it also helps them get an education because they're working for CBP. Great program. I think it's a great way to help with the pilot shortage in the aviation industry, both manned and unmanned, so I want to commend you on that. And then I want to kind of switch gears for a minute and ask about when you do detain, apprehend unaccompanied children coming across the border, as well as others, what are you doing to try to address the adjudication process, which is such a bottleneck in terms of trying to address this issue? I know you're short there. What can you do and what are you doing, to try to adjudicate these individuals?
So as I continue to find out every day, our immigration process is very complex, as you well know, and involves many, many departments. What we've tried to do is look at it from an end-to-end approach. So in the example you just gave, there's actually about 3 or 4 different processes that those groups would undertake. So in some cases, we need additional immigration judges. DOJ is working on that. In some cases, we need additional processes and agreements with other parts of the interagency family. We've done that, for example, with HHS to make sure that we're appropriately taking care of UACs in their custody. And then there's other parts who, depending on if they're referred for prosecution, we hand them over to the marshals. We want to make sure that that's a process that works. And then in some cases, we use alternates to detention. As you know, rather than detaining them, we will have check-ins, in some cases ankle bracelets, but other ways to make sure that we have them detained while they're awaiting their removal.
Is that
proceeding.
working?
It does work. It does work. So it's a good combination. We do it on a case-by-case basis. There's lots of criteria that we look at to determine when that's appropriate and when that's not appropriate. But again, I think it's some of the opening remarks perhaps the chairman made. If you look at UAC, 66% of those who receive final orders receive the final orders purely because they never showed up for court. And we find that we're only able to remove 3.5% of those who should be removed, who a judge has said has a final. So if we can track them, it's a much more efficient process while we wait for the final adjudication.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, and thanks for the work you're doing. I mean, it was challenging work. We appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Carper.
Thanks. Again, Secretary Nielsen, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, sir.
We got a couple of recovering governors here on this panel, and I still think like one. And one of the things I focus on is I do customer calls in my state. I visit businesses large and small throughout the year. And our governor and I visited yesterday a fairly large financial services company in the northern part of our state. Last week I was down in the southern part of our state where we do a lot of agriculture. And I don't care where I go, I hear employers, large and small, talk about how difficult it is to find people who will come to work and actually do a job. And I don't care if it's landscaping, I don't care if it's like food processing, I don't care if it's someone working in financial services. They're having a hard time getting people who actually could pass a drug test, who have the skills, and will come to work. And you and I have talked a bit about how to address at least part of this challenge. And we talked, in fact, I led a letter, I think, about a couple of dozen senators who wrote to you and urged you to use the authority that we granted in the spending bill for the balance of this fiscal year to go ahead and issue additional H-2B visas. And I think you're basically, the legislation we passed, we authorized a doubling of that cap to maybe another 69,000. And I guess my question is not going to solve all of our problems for all of our employers, as you know, but you have this authority. We hear literally this week from companies that they're afraid they're going to lose their business because they don't have people come to work and do the jobs. They're seasonal jobs. And so let me just ask, what is the timeline for releasing additional H-2B visas, and when will you announce the decision? And how many additional visas does the department plan to release?
Thank you, sir. It's in final interagency process. As you know, it involves regulation. So the regulation should be ready here shortly. And the
Can I just say something? I don't mean
Yeah.
to be rude.
No.
I don't mean to interrupt you. That's not good enough. I mean, these companies, they're highly seasonal. They need the folks now. They needed them a month ago. And to say that, and whenever I talk to you about this, and it's basically we're working this, we're going through the process and so forth. They need the workers now.
Yeah, I understand.
If they were here, they
I
would tell
understand.
you.
I've been collecting evidence. I've asked everyone I've talked to give me examples so that I can in turn package it and send it back to Congress to say, please put next year, please put the ceiling in law. There's no need to tie
They
it to an
gave you the
appropriations
authority to
bill.
basically double
I
the
understand,
number of
but if-
visas
if-
you
if
can
you all
issue.
are
You have the
funded-
power. This administration is not reluctant about using executive power.
If you all are wanting to help the companies, which I know you are, the best thing that we can do is give them stability and predictability. Putting them into a situation each year where we wait on an appropriation cycle and we wait on whichever secretary is secretary then to make a determination does not give them the ability to plan and keep their businesses open. So I would respectfully request, again, that Congress work with us to put this in law. We know it's a need. Let's just put it in law, and then everybody knows what it is, and the businesses can plan.
We put it in law. We said there's 69,000 visas that could be issued now, additional visas, and all you have to do is do it. There's plenty of need. There's plenty of need.
But sir,
Use
if you,
that
if
authority.
you wanted 69,000 additional, just put it in law, and then there's no discretion and there's no timing. It's already in law, and everyone can plan to it. So as we've
That's
discussed.
a very disappointing, that's very disappointing.
Well, it shouldn't be, because I think we both want to help the companies. So I'm telling you, in my experience, this is the best way to help them, is to give them some predictability and not tie it.
Pardon me, if our roles were different, and you were the Senate, and I was the Secretary of the Department, we would issue those 69,000 visas. We put a lot of people to work and help frankly, save a lot of businesses from going under. Let me ask my second question. Thank you. The decision to extend or terminate TPS lies with the Secretary of Homeland Security, as you know, in consultation with the State Department. Your predecessor and former Deputy Elaine Duke declined to end TPS for Honduras only 4 months ago in November. Did you speak with Ms. Duke or other former administration officials prior to terminating TPS for Honduras? Did you speak with Jim Nealon, our former ambassador to Honduras?
At the time before Ambassador Nealon and then Deputy Secretary Duke left, yes, I did talk with them.
And can you give us some idea what was said?
No, I cannot, sir. Those are pre-deliberative conversations.
Mm-hmm. Former Secretary Kelly also said in an interview on NPR, I think it was last week, he said, I think we should fold all the TPS people that have been here for a considerable period of time and find a way for them to a path of citizenship. And those are his words. From last week, do you agree with General Kelly's remarks?
I have said the same under oath.
Okay. We talked in this room oftentimes about root causes, why people come here from Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador, and other places. They come here because their lives are not just difficult, their lives in many cases are horrendous. We contribute directly to that. In the last administration, there was a fair amount of discussion about root causes. We put in place, Congress passed the Alliance for Prosperity, sort of like a Central American version, as you know, of Plan Colombia. Haven't heard much about what's going on there lately. And maybe you can bring us up to speed. As you know, Plan Colombia has been taking a long time, 20 years, but over time it's become very successful. And what's going on with Alliance for Prosperity, and how are we doing there?
So as I understand it, sir, the State Department is distributing funds, but as you know, that is a State Department program. What we are doing at DHS is we worked in conjunction with state and the government of Mexico, Spain, Canada, others last year to host a conference with the Northern Triangle to talk about this issue and talk about how to increase their prosperity in addition to security. We plan to host such a conference again next month.
When and where?
In D.C., and we don't have the exact date because it'll be around the Organization of American States, so it's a bit up to them as to which date works, so we're still finalizing a date. But we are working on some interesting programs to help in the same way. One that I have found to be very interesting is one with El Salvador, where it's a micro-competition, and the company who wins receives about $27,000 equivalent, which is the amount they would otherwise pay a smuggler to come to the United States. So it allows them to stay in country and open up a business. So we are working on creative ways to try to help. I agree with you. We have to help the countries as well with the push and pull factors. And of course, as you and I have talked about before, we also have to increase our overall drug demand here so that we don't have that pull factor.
All right. As they say at Home Depot, you can do it, we can help. They can do it. We have an obligation, I think, a moral obligation to help. Thank you.
Senator Hassan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member McCaskill. And Secretary Nielsen, thank you for appearing before the committee. Just a couple of weeks ago, I traveled to the U.S. southern border to meet with Border Patrol, port officers, and ICE detention officers. We know that people are dying on both sides of the border as a result of the drug cartel's narcotics trafficking efforts. In 2016, drug overdoses killed more than 60,000 Americans, while in 2017, Mexico hit a record of nearly 30,000 homicides, the vast majority of which resulted from the drug trade violence. These numbers go hand in hand. The drug cartels use violence and money to dominate their smuggling routes, killing many innocent Mexicans and migrants. The cartel's success means that more and more drugs make their way into the United States, where Americans are dying from overdoses at unprecedented rates. I was impressed by my visits to El Paso and McAllen, Texas, to see the robust screening effort conducted by CBP of incoming traffic from Mexico. In fact, in El Paso, just before I arrived, they had seized 25 pounds of cocaine because we have vigilant, excellent CBP port officers, as I know you know. However, stopping the drug cartels is not solely a matter of securing traffic coming into the United States. We have to attack the cartel's business model. That means stopping the flow of both money, drug money and weapons that travel southbound into Mexico from the United States. Unfortunately, as I saw on my trip, our southbound screening effort for traffic leaving the U.S. for Mexico pales in comparison to CBC's screening of traffic entering the U.S. We're in a system that our officers referred to as pulse and search, so intermittent checking of southbound traffic. We were told by CBP officials that they need expanded facilities, more personnel, and updated technology in order to try to strengthen our ability to stop the flow of guns and money back into the cartel's hands. So are you satisfied with the current state of southbound inspections along the southern border?
No.
And what more do you need, and what actions will you take to address these shortfalls?
So the ports, as you know, are very different, the infrastructure. Right. So part of what we're doing is I've had multiple conversations with the government of Mexico on this exact issue. I've committed to them that we will decrease the flow of guns and money headed their direction. But part of it is an agreement with them as to how we can restructure the port so that we have those secondary lanes so that we can pull people over when we suspect. So we're doing more. We're working on agreements back and forth, and then we're working on some modeling and data that would lead us to a resource request to come to you.
Well, that would be excellent. What I heard loudly and clearly from our wonderful subject matter experts at the border was that they need more people, and I think that echoes what you heard from Senator McCaskill. We need more people at the ports of entry. We need them southbound as well as northbound, and I also know there were some infrastructure issues for those second lanes of traffic and the like, but I would look forward to working with you on that. I also wanted to touch on another issue that we heard about on the border. As you know, last year Congress passed the Interdict Act, which requires DHS to increase the number of fentanyl screening devices available to CBP officers. The officers have faced a shortage of these devices, which are essential to identifying correctly fentanyl and other drugs, as well as keeping CBP officers safe from these toxic chemicals. Despite the passage of the Interdict Act, the port personnel I spoke with made clear that the devices were still in short supply. When I spoke to them about the Interdict Act legislation and its mission, they were encouraged by the possibility of more devices heading their way, but they had clearly not received the benefits that we intended when we passed this bill and when the president signed it into law. Now that was, I think, in December. So why aren't the devices getting into the hands of these port officers? What accounts for the delay, and what are our plans to get more devices there?
Well, first of all, that's unacceptable. So you have my commitment to look into it and get back to you this week. I am not aware that they don't have the devices. They need to be trained. They need the protective gear to, as you know, touch packages, and they also need the devices. So
they have, you know, I saw one of the devices. The issue is they just don't have enough for them all to use, and I think our intent was to get
absolutely. I will look
this
into
technology to our personnel as quickly as we could. And then another issue that came up, because I went from the border then down to Mexico City, and in my meetings with U.S. Embassy personnel in Mexico City and with key Mexican government officials, we discussed how Mexico has to significantly grow its federal police force if it's going to have success against the drug cartels. While the Mexican government has to find the resources and the will to expand the federal police force, the United States can certainly play a key role in helping to train and professionalize the police force. In a meeting with the National Security Commissioner Salas, I conveyed how every law enforcement officer in the state of New Hampshire attends the same training facility in order to standardize and professionalize their training. And I also shared how DHS runs the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, or FLETC, in order to integrate and standardize law enforcement training for over 90 federal law enforcement units. Has DHS considered working with its Mexican counterparts to help provide trainings to Mexican federal law enforcement?
Absolutely, and we actually do. We've graduated some already from training facilities. We're continuing to expand that. We also work with Samar and Sedona, parts of the military,
Right.
which, as you know, play a huge role.
Right.
We've done a lot of training with them. We do a lot of joint operations back and forth across the border. But yes, this would be a priority for us.
And so when you say a lot of joint training, do we open up parts of FLETC to our Mexican counterparts? Can they come over and train with
We
us?
do offer courses for Mexican counterparts, yes, ma'am. I will get you the locations. I believe it's at FLETC, but if not, it's a DHS-owned facility.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I will have more questions for a second round, but I'm happy to yield now. Thank you.
Senator Harris.
Thank you, Secretary Nielsen. As I sit here today, I'm extremely concerned about the administration's repeated attacks on some of the most vulnerable communities, and in particular children and pregnant women, as it relates to the work of DHS. And in particular, under your leadership, DHS has rescinded the DACA program, and under the leadership of the administration, predating your arrival as Secretary, DHS has rescinded the DACA program, putting 700,000 young people at risk of deportation. It has separated 700 children from their parents at the border since October of 2017, including more than 100 children who are under the age of 4. The agency has released a directive that allows for more detention of pregnant women to immigrant detention facilities. The agency has instituted a new information sharing system between the Office of Refugee Resettlement and ICE that is likely to have a chilling effect on sponsors who otherwise would be willing to come forward to provide care for unaccompanied minors, and instead of allowing those children to remain in detention. The agency has dramatically increased enforcement actions that have left an untold number of both immigrant and U.S. citizen children without one or both parents, leaving some of those children in the child welfare system. And then just last Wednesday, the Washington Post reported that you are considering undermining the Flores Agreement, an agreement that ensures standards of care for immigrant children, such as the provision of meals and recreation, and that they are placed in a least restrictive setting as possible. In the course of carrying out these actions, the administration has routinely provided misleading information to this committee, and has even gone so far as to claim that policies such as routinely separating families are carried out in the best interest of the child, which many consider to be cruel. So my question to you is, last Thursday, when the New York Times reported that the President has directed you to separate parents from children when they cross into the United States as a way to deter illegal immigration, is that correct? Have you been directed to separate parents from children as a method of deterrence of undocumented immigration?
I have not been directed to do that for purposes of deterrence, no.
What purpose have you been given for separating parents from their children?
So my decision has been that anyone who breaks the law will be prosecuted. If you're a parent, or you're a single person, or you happen to have a family, if you cross between the ports of entry, we will refer you for prosecution. You've broken U.S. law.
At an April 26th hearing, I asked Undersecretary James McCammett to provide me with what percentage of cases exist in your agency where a child has been separated from a parent or guardian since October of 2017, wherein the case resulted in trafficking charges. I've not been given that information. Can you provide that to me?
I do not have it now, but yes, I will provide it to you.
Okay, can you do that by the end of next week?
If we have the information, yes.
Thank you. I also asked that I be provided with what training and procedures are being given to CBP officers as it relates to how they are instructed to carry out family separation. I've not received that information. Do you have that today?
No, you have not asked me for it, so I do not have it, but
No,
I'm
I
happy
asked
to give
him
it
for
to you.
it. Okay, so again, by the end of next week, please.
Can you explain a little more what you're looking for?
Sure. So your agency will be separating children from their parents. And I
No,
would
what
assume,
we'll be doing is prosecuting parents who've broken the law, just as we do every day in the United States of America.
I can appreciate that, but if that parent has a 4-year-old child, what do you plan on doing with that child?
The child under law goes to HHS for care and custody,
They will be separated from their parent.
just
And so
like
my
we do in the
question-
United States
so-
every day.
So they will be separated from their parent. And my question then is, when you are separating children from their parents, do you have a protocol in place about how that should be done? And are you training the people who will actually remove a child from their parent on how to do that in the least traumatic way? I would hope you do train on how to do that. And so the question is, and the request has been, to give us the information about how you are training and what the protocols are for separating a child from their parent.
I'm happy to provide you with the training information.
Thank you. And what steps are being taken, if you can tell me, to ensure that once separated, parent and child, that there will be an opportunity to at least sustain communication between the parent and their child?
The children are at HHS, but I'm happy to work with HHS to get you an answer for that.
And I'd like it to be broken down between what you're doing for children over the age of 4 and what you're doing for children under the age of 4. On May 4th, the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics issued a statement on behalf of the organization stating that he is appalled by a new policy by the DHS that will forcibly separate children from their parents. He went on to talk about that they will create stressful experiences like family separation, which can cause irreparable harm, disrupting a child's brain architecture, affecting his or her short and long-term health. And these findings are generally shared by the American Medical Association and many child welfare advocates and professionals. Last Tuesday, before Senate appropriations, you testified that you are, quote, working with the community to understand the science as it relates to the impact of such separation. Do you dispute that separating a child from their parent will create and cause trauma for that child?
I believe the question that was asked to me if I was aware of the information, and what I said is I would be happy to look into the studies. Again, we do not have a policy to separate children from their parents. Our policy is if you break the law, we will prosecute you. You have an option to go to a port of entry and not illegally cross into our country.
Secretary Nielsen, we do have a policy in this country as a general matter in the justice system that if someone breaks the law, they will be prosecuted. We also have protocols about what is allowable and not in connection with an arrest, in connection with detention in a jail, in connection with how many hours or days with which we can bring charges or not. So to suggest that the only law in this country relates to what you do at the end is really misleading.
But that's not what I just said, ma'am. If you're asking if we train and we take care of them and we work with HHS, we now have a memorandum of agreement so that we can make sure that the children go to people who are actually family members and who are not traffickers and who won't abuse them.
Great, so those are the policies I'd like to see.
Okay.
Thank you.
Before I go to Senator Langford, I think this is a good time. Actually, Senator Daines, I see you showed up. This would be a good time to explain a little bit more when you say that we do this every, prosecutors, law enforcement, local law enforcement does this every day. So let's consider maybe a drug dealer, single parent with children in the home. That drug dealer is arrested. Is there any difference really in terms of how DHS handles somebody who you're going to prosecute, that you're going to detain, somebody who has entered the country through the port, other than the ports of entry? Is there any difference in terms of how a DHS would handle that situation, those children, than what local law enforcement, other than different jurisdictions may have different rules?
Right. So broadly speaking, not to my knowledge, the idea here is to make sure that the now unaccompanied children or the children whose parent is incarcerated because they broke a law are cared for. So we transfer those to HHS, and as I just mentioned, we have now worked on a memorandum of agreement to ensure that those children are not then in turn placed in the hands of traffickers, criminals, et cetera.
And again, I want to underscore, that only applies to family units, a parent that crosses illegally between the ports of entry. If they show up at the port, claim asylum, those family units are kept together because we have a process for that.
In current policy, yes, sir.
Okay, Senator Daines.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Nielsen, it's good to see you again. Thank you for your service to secure our homeland. I am thankful for the leadership you are showing in terms of deploying National Guard resources to secure our borders, building the first border wall in 10 years, establishing a national vetting process to better target those with criminal intent who seek to enter this country. As a father of 4 children myself, I sleep better knowing you are leading and securing our homeland. Thank you. I want to switch gears and talk about flooding in my home state of Montana. We had a tremendous snowpack this winter. The skiers were thrilled. As a fly fisherman, I can't wait. Once as we say, the rivers blow out, they clear up, we get on the rivers. But in the meantime, we have flooding going on in Montana. We're facing severe flooding due to rapidly melting snowpack in our mountains, combined with some recent heavy rainfall. Surging rivers and streams have affected our communities across our state, forcing families from homes, schools, businesses, roadways are closing. In fact, Montana has declared a statewide flooding emergency and mobilized state resources, but more flooding is yet to come, and federal aid is going to be needed. How is DHS assisting these affected communities in Montana now? And how can your department provide support in the coming months as we deal with additional flooding, as well as, believe it or not, the upcoming wildfire season?
Yes, I can't believe we're there again already between that and hurricane season. So what we're doing at FEMA is we're trying to increase the capability and capacity in general towards resilience. So in part that means we're using things called integrated management teams. We're pushing people out into communities to help them build their capacity for incident management. We have conducted various reviews on alert and warning. We're reviewing the equipment needs and requirements. And then as you know, in certain cases, once the thresholds of the Stafford Act are met under a national disaster, there are funds available from the Disaster Relief Fund. So it's a combination of on-the-ground capacity building exercises, et cetera, and then funding, of course, when the thresholds are met.
Thank you, and I know we'll be in touch with your team as we continue to excuse the metaphor, navigate through these difficult times right now in Montana. I want to switch gears now and talk about the National Guard on the southwest border. As you point out in your testimony, there's probably no issue more important for DHS right now than border security and immigration. According to CBP's southwest border migration numbers for April, the number of illegal border crossers more than tripled in April of 2018 compared to April of 2017. Securing our borders is crucial to protecting the American people and upholding the rule of law. I'm grateful to hear from you today in response to some of the questions. It's about the rule of law. It's what sets this great nation apart, is freedom and the rule of law. You're doing an admirable job, and I know you and your workforce are working tirelessly to get the job done. More resources are needed, however, and I support President Trump's call last month for the deployment of the National Guard to enhance CBP's capacities out at our southwest border. My question for you is, what further steps will be taken by the administration to mitigate illegal activity at the border?
Many things, as much as we can do within the law. So we're changing regs to the extent that we can to clarify particular issues. We are doing all this in the protection of UACs, like the MOU that I just mentioned. We're working with the border governors. So as you may know, I have had lots of conversations, and I talk with them monthly, Governor Abbott, Governor Ducey, Governor Martinez, Governor Brown, not just on the deployment of the National Guard, but what else we can do with local communities, with border sheriffs, to make sure that when we identify criminal aliens, that we can apprehend them and remove them. We also are working through some pilot projects with Mexico on ways that we can prevent the flows that do not have a legitimate claim to come to this country. Again, I encourage all migrants, if they have a need to flee, to seek shelter in that first safe country that they encounter. So we'll continue to do all we can on our side.
Thank you. The issue of children came up in the last line of questioning. I want to probe that a bit more with you. I've introduced legislation with my colleague from New Hampshire, Senator Hassan. It's called the Homeland Security for Children Act. which would simply ensure that DHS includes input from organizations representing the needs of children when soliciting stakeholder feedback and developing policies. The question is, do you believe it's important to identify and integrate the needs of children into the policies and activities of the department?
I think it is our duty to protect them, to keep them in a safe environment, to provide for them when they're in our care, and to make sure that within that 48-hour period when we transfer them to HHS, that we do all we can to help HHS then take care of those children. Yes, I do.
One thing I've seen and appreciate your response there is I think we need to make sure that the necessary steps are in place so that children are kept safe during emergencies. We think about preparedness. Sometimes we don't always remember in the policies the importance of children and thinking about their unique needs. Lastly, I want to talk about border wall contractors. A number of state and local governments are considering legislation that would require them to discriminate against companies involved in the design or construction of any extension of the wall along our southern border. Further, some cities are targeting contractors that provide database services supporting federal immigration priorities. This type of legislation could obstruct the federal government's lawful functions and cause private companies contracted with the federal government to hesitate in fulfilling the critical roles asked of them. My question is, what is the position of the department on this issue, and how do you plan to respond?
So we continue to work with border governors and government officials. I would just say that border security is the most basic and necessary requirement of a country to protect its citizens. So I do worry that the either intended or unintended consequence of this would be that the federal government cannot do its most basic duty to protect its citizens. But we're also trying to work with them to explain and find out what the real concern is, because it's not always clear on its face what the concern is, other than they just don't agree with us enforcing the law.
Thank you, sir. Secretary Nielsen. Thanks.
Senator McCaskill has a question for you real quick.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify something. There was, the chairman wanted to equate the process by which children are separated from their parents to a similar process when someone is arrested in, let's just take a community where I was the elected prosecutor for years. When a child is left without a parent because of breaking the law in the state system, the police hand it over to the social service agency, who then has primary responsibility ongoing through social workers, placement, a child abuse hotline. They are always in contact with the state authorities until there is some kind of permanency to their legal situation. Let's compare and contrast what happens with DHS. DHS keeps the children for maybe 48 hours, hands off to HHS. HHS then tries to put them somewhere. And very, very, very few even household visits for sponsors. And then they're done after they find a sponsor. There is no handing off to the state social service agencies. That's why nobody's showing up for the hearing, Secretary. It's because it's not like the state system. I can assure you that if a child was supposed to show up somewhere that was in a state's care, phone would ring, or the child abuse hotline would ring, or a teacher would be required to call in. That's not happening with these kids. That's why they're not coming to court. Nobody's paying any attention. So I just couldn't let it pass that we were equating those two systems, because having a great deal of experience in one of them, having handled child abuse cases for a number of years, nothing is further than the truth. And there is still not a joint concept of operations, which was promised to Senator Portman and I at a hearing in 2016 as to how we're going to alleviate this problem. So once you start taking these children, please, I don't think any record should reflect that somehow you are confident, or anybody is confident, that they're being placed in a safe and secure environment and being appropriately managed, because frankly, if they were, they'd come to their hearings.
So could I just respond to that?
Sure.
I think the comparison I was trying to make was in the separation of families. It's not something unique we do with illegal aliens when someone has broken the law.
You have to separate children from families when there's been a violation.
Yes, ma'am. But having said that, I just want to say I couldn't agree with your concerns more, period. We are working with HHS. We've done this MOA. I will look into the CONOPS. I do know that we've revised it because We now, in conjunction with HHS, are requiring various checks be made to ensure that the sponsor truly does have a custodial relationship and is not a trafficker or an abuser. And as you know, we've had terrible instances of that occurring. It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable.
You know, the fact that there isn't a CONOPS, the fact that there is no joint concept of operations, and we are upping the number of children we're taking from families is outrageous.
So there is a CONOPS. What I'm suggesting is
we've not seen it.
yeah, and I appreciate that, and we'll get it to you. We're updating it because we now have this MOA with HHS that requires both of us to share information so that we can vet the sponsor who appears to take the child, especially when that sponsor is not a parent. So this is why we just signed this MOA. I couldn't agree more. We have to do more.
And of course, I would completely agree the state's going to be better than the federal government at just about anything it does. And the point I was making in terms of DACA, I mean, I completely understand that that does not apply to current arrivals, but they don't know that. That DACA was used as a spark. They were told once they get there, they can stay. And by the way, they have. 96.5% of unaccompanied children from Central America have stayed. They use social media. That's communicated down to Central America, and more come. So it's that flood into a federal system that has created the crisis. So again, the goal of policy ought to be to reduce the flow, like Secretary Chertoff did in Brazil. Senator Heinkamp.
Yeah, I don't think I can let that go without at least some comment. DACA, if you say it was a magnet that pulled people because they are so connected, they certainly are connected enough to know that the program's been terminated. So we know that Central America presents a unique problem as it relates to unaccompanied minors because of a law that was passed by the United States Congress. So the wringing of hands about what is in fact the draw into this country it's critically important that we look at this from what is driving the factors below. And you and I have had long conversations about the need to work with the other countries in the region to allow people to refugee in place, to allow people to live with their families in a safe location somewhere within the region. We're on the verge of having a very anti-American government elected in Mexico. It's going to make your job even harder. And so we can talk about why that is. I think we should just recognize it's going to happen. So we have to prepare for a relationship change that we're going to have that's going to create a even greater problem. But we have to be humanitarian about how we deal with this, especially as it relates to children. Now, we all sat at this dais, about a month ago, and I think I said we're the worst foster parents in the world. We don't keep track of these kids. And we are begging you, if in fact this is going to be the outcome where we're separating children, in some cases infants, from their parents, we need to know where these kids are.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, that hasn't been...
Again, in
right.
the last administration, there was no MOA to even screen or vet sponsors. I have put that in place.
I'm not talking about politics here.
No, I'm not either.
Talking about children.
I'm saying what we've done to improve the situation, because you're exactly right. We owe more to these children to protect them. So I'm saying I agree, we've taken steps, and we will continue to strengthen what our partners do to protect these children. They're not in our custody, but I take it upon myself to work with my interagency partners to do this.
And I would share Senator Harris's concern about making sure people are trauma-informed and trauma-trained, because what you're doing to children when you take them away from their parents is the most trauma-impactful thing you can do to a child. So let's be good. Let's be good people. And good Americans as it relates to how we treat children. But I don't want to use my whole time. I want to talk a little bit about the Northern Border Strategy. You probably figured this is going to come up. You're 5 months late in getting me the plan. When is that plan going to happen?
It should be out this week.
Okay, thank you. I'll look forward to seeing it, and thank you again. I think, again, we have such a hyper-focus on the southwest border, a hyper-focus on the open areas of the southwest border, and as Senator McCaskill pointed out, a lot of the drug traffic is coming through the points of entry. We know that that's a problem that we need to address, and that brings me to the second thing I want want to get at, which is technology, and understanding what that technology, what's available, what we're doing right now to train, what we're doing right now to provide resources. I want to associate myself with the remarks of my senior senator, Senator Hoven. We appreciate the work that's being done to train pilots. I think that we have a great resource in North Dakota with the co-location of Customs and Border Protection, Air and Marine, along with the Air Base, along with a training center for training pilots, along with a lot of great law enforcement folks who are working to try and figure out how we can embed and use new technologies. So I again invite you to come up to North Dakota,
Yes,
take a look.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I think you'll find some very interesting things up on the border. One of the unique problems that we have in North Dakota, as you know, is hiring and retention. That's not just a problem in North Dakota, but it's a problem across the agency. Senator McCaskill, I think, made a great point on retention. What do you think is going to improve retention, and how do we get a better answer on how we can deal with the attrition challenge that you have?
Yeah, this is, for obvious reasons, all the ones that Ranking Member McCaskill mentioned and you did as well, important, but it's also important just for basic morale, right? It's important for us to be able to do our job. So I do take this very seriously, and of my 6 priorities, one is what I call employees first, and this is a big chunk of that. You know, what is it can we do to make them willing to continue to serve and to conserve?
Why do you think they're leaving now?
I think, you know, one of the things that we found over the last year is the system was not built for mobility. So if you are in a rural, it's not even rural, if you're in an area where there's just not a lot of infrastructure, particularly on the southern border, if you are a young CBP agent, you might be willing to do that for a few years, but if the system can't allow you to move, you might just decide to leave. So one of the things we've built in is that mobility. We've also built in cross-training. We find that particularly in some of the areas, what you were trained to do is not necessarily what you do because of the limited.
One of the pieces of advice that Senator Tester used to provide, and I used to follow up on, is, you know, there's people who live up there. There's people who live on the northern tier. They like it. That's home. They hunt. They fish. They know exactly what they're doing. You know, they have friends and family. We need to do better recruiting from the local people who live there, who have lived that lifestyle. Because if you move someone in from Tennessee, let's say, and then an ICE position comes open in Tennessee, we'll lose them from Border Patrol. And so we've seen this, we've talked to the folks up there, very, very much would like to see you look at recruiting within the area, because those are folks who are used to that lifestyle.
So
Finally, I want to.
Really quickly on that one, we found that we weren't very good at that, which is partly why we're working with Accenture, and I know Ranking Member had some concerns that she mentioned at the front end. Happy to come and speak to you both about that, but part of the concept of that Accenture contract is to go into those areas and recruit there for people that we need there because of exactly what you're saying.
No, I think you'd be more successful in terms of retention, and I'm out of time. I'll probably submit some additional questions for the record, and you probably know I'm concerned and aware of some challenges we have with the border sheriffs. That's a critical relationship both in the northern border and the southern border, and we want to follow up on some of the issues that we've had with the local law enforcement.
Yes, and Chairman, do you mind if I just respond to that quickly?
No, fine.
You and I had a brief conversation. I couldn't agree more. I spoke with the sheriff in Cochise County. I've met with a variety of sheriffs when I was in Texas. Met with the National Sheriff's Association last week.
Good.
We'll continue to meet with them. But yes, we look to their expertise, their experience. They're a very important part of understanding the needs.
And they can be an incredible resource for you in terms of intel if you have a relationship with them.
Yes, I agree. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, I just want to offer clarification. I think Senator Heinekamp, said DHS does this to the children or families. When a parent brings a child illegally into this country between the ports of entry, DHS is responding, reacting to that illegal act. I hate to give advice, but you know, if those parents want to do it legally, they can go right up to the port of entry, claim asylum, and then basically have to make the case. But they're coming across illegally because they don't want to have to go through that process, the legal process. So Secretary Nielsen, DHS is enforcing the laws, and if we don't like the laws, we're going to have to try and change them. But again, it's not what DHS is doing to them. DHS is forced to react and is forced to follow the law.
Yes, sir.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Secretary Nielsen.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for being here. Secretary Nielsen, I think you're well aware of probably the most significant threat that we have to our national security comes from cyber attacks, and we're seeing these cyber attacks increase in frequency as well as in sophistication. And as this committee has discussed this issue on numerous occasions, we always talk about a whole of government approach, that we have to bring all of our resources to bear in order to thwart this threat. And yet, oftentimes, we operate in silos. Different agencies are doing their own thing, and there isn't any kind of communication between them. And so there's been a pretty concerted effort to try to harmonize responsibilities as well as understand those whole of government capabilities that may exist across the breadth of government. And I know that DHS, along with a number of other civilian and military entities, have certainly made some significant progress in this area, but we also need to have leadership from the White House to make sure that this actually happens. And that's why I was disappointed to hear reports that National Security Advisor John Bolton is considering eliminating the White House Cyber Coordinator position within the White House. What impact would this change in leadership have, do you think, on the national cyber mission?
So I have not had a conversation with Ambassador Bolton about that particular issue. What I would suggest, at least from a DHS perspective, we have strengthened all of our relationships with the silos that you referenced to make sure that we're bringing all to bear, not just through sharing of capacity and capabilities, but clarifying and re-clarifying our roles and responsibilities from policy efforts. So your underlying point is valid. It's top of mind for me because no one entity has all of the authorities, capability, and capacity to address this. So we have to bring everything we have to bear. Within DHS, I find that we have pockets of excellence within the Secret Service, within ICE, within the Coast Guard, within TSA, and of course within NPPD. So we're trying to knit all that together so that we have best-in-class services, sort of that collective defense model.
So you mentioned you weren't aware of this statement that John Bolton made. Could you tell me a little bit about the kind of coordination that goes on between DHS cyber leadership and the White House in relation to cybersecurity? Is there ongoing communication coordination?
Since Ambassador Bolton has come onto the job, he and I speak regularly. We spoke over the weekend about events that were emerging in Tennessee, for example, and the alleged cyber attack. So we continue to work together. If there are any issues that we ever have that we need to raise to their attention, we do so. We are working hand in glove on the National Cybersecurity Strategy. We released the DHS Cybersecurity Strategy today. We did that in close coordination with NSC.
It's been reported that the United States may see increased cyber attacks from Iran in the coming weeks and months. Has the department seen an increase in Iranian cyber attacks in the past week?
We have not, but we are looking. We have something posture that we called Shields Up. We're in close coordination with state and local governments, private sector, critical infrastructure owners and operators, and the intel community, constantly asking and assessing to see if we see any uptick in activity.
So you're anticipating it may be a reality?
We're anticipating it's a possibility, and therefore we will be prepared.
I would discuss the northern border, pick up on Senator Heinkamp coming from northern border up in Michigan. We have two of the nation's busiest border crossings in Michigan, one up in Port Huron with Canada and Sarnia, and down in Detroit. We have had a number of issues in terms of staffing and capacity. Those border crossings are particularly important from an economic standpoint, and I know the difficult balancing act that the department has to keep us safe by at the same time making sure that commerce moves efficiently across those borders. Right now, we're in the process of building a second bridge in the Detroit-Windsor, which is one of the top crossings in the country, in North America, the Gordie Howe Bridge. In fact, it's been funded by the Canadian government, but looking for resources from the United States to make sure that our customs plaza is fully funded. Do I have your commitment that that will be fully funded and properly staffed so that we can achieve that twin goal of keeping us safe while at the same time allowing commerce to move efficiently across that border?
Yes, we would like to facilitate legal trade and travel, as you know. I'm not as familiar with this, but yes, we would want to make sure that it allows legal trade and travel and facilitates that.
Well, I would like to have a further discussion with you or your
Happy
staff
to.
as well. This is a critical issue for us, and I can appreciate you may not be fully up to speed on this particular one, but it's one that I think we need to pursue, and I'd love to have that conversation. And it goes actually with the other border crossing, which is the Blue Water Bridge, which is between Sarnia and Port Huron. That's a border crossing that needs to be expanded. In fact, the government came in and condemned a number of houses with eminent domain, cleared out land because of a customs expansion that should have taken place years ago. It still has not occurred. It's an incredibly problematic situation, to say the least, for the city of Port Huron. And it's a piece of critical infrastructure. Do you have any idea when that plaza will be completed? And is that something that you're prepared to talk about today?
No, but we'll get you an answer this week.
Well, I would appreciate that as well. We'll follow up. The other final piece of major infrastructure in Michigan is the Sioux Locks, which connect Lake Superior with the rest of the Great Lakes system. DHS reported in 2016 that if the PO lock, which is the major lock that can allow the large freighters to move through there, if anything happens to that lock, within a matter of weeks, the entire U.S. economy would go into a recession. You would have production facilities shut down, factories, mines, auto parts would have difficulty being constructed. So it certainly fits the definition of critical infrastructure in no uncertain terms. We had President Trump in our state recently who made a statement that we're going to fix the Sioux locks. We're going to construct the additional lock that we've been looking for some time. Could you give us an update on that?
Sure. So what we've done at DHS is look at the modeling, because as you say, it's a concentrated point of dependency, and some might even argue it's a single point of failure when it comes to trade. So we're doing the modeling, and then we're also working with our counterparts in Commerce, the Council of Economic Advisors of the White House, to make sure that we understand all of the consequences. It is critical infrastructure. We treat it as such, so we're continuing that voluntary relationship to make sure that we have the redundancy and resiliency built in. But happy to come give you a more detailed brief about what specifically we're doing.
Well, I would like to brief on what has happened since the President's statement. We have the report from DHS, which clearly states that it's critical infrastructure
Yes.
that could lead to a recession. The Army Corps of Engineers are finishing a study that we expect to see shortly that will also come to what I believe will be a similar conclusion. But it's something that we need to focus on, and look forward to meeting with your folks to talk further about it.
Thank you.
I agree, Senator Peters, on that one. Senator Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary Nielsen, thank you for
Good afternoon.
being here today and for being here at a critical time. You're in the process of putting your own imprint on a massive organization that was created by Congress some 16 years ago and has never been reauthorized since. And I appreciate the fact, Mr. Chairman, that you and the ranking member, Senator McCaskill, have worked hard on a authorization bill, again, for the first time in almost 2 decades. It's overdue, in my view, and I think there's a lot of positive things in that bill. So we appreciate your working with us. I asked you earlier today in a conversation what you thought about it, and I think you're generally supportive of it.
Yes, sir.
And I hope you'll work with the chair and ranking member to get that, not just to the Senate floor for a vote, but to get that signed into law. There are a number of provisions in that bill that I feel strongly about. One is some of my provisions to strengthen security for nonprofit institutions, focusing research on some emerging threats, as was talked about earlier, in the cybersecurity space, also in chemical weapons, as well as some important requirements to combat the illicit opioids that are coming into our country. You know, we here in my state of Ohio have had epidemic levels of opioid addiction and overdoses and deaths, starting with prescription drugs and heroin. And now it's this synthetic heroin or synthetic opioids, including fentanyl, carfentanil, and others. And it's now the big problem. I mean, we had 60% of the people who died in Ohio last year, our worst year ever, died because of fentanyl. Locally in Columbus, Ohio, they just issued a report from Franklin County that 2/3 of their deaths last year were attributable to fentanyl. It's coming in through the U.S. mail system primarily. That's what all the experts say, including testimony before this committee and before our permanent subcommittee investigations. So our own United States mail system is providing the conduit for this poison. It's not coming overland from Mexico as heroin was. It's, at least the vast majority of it is not. Most is coming from China, We know where it's coming from. We know how it's coming. And we know that the post office, unbelievably, does not require the same information on packages as other private carriers have to in order for law enforcement to identify those packages. So the post office has about 900 million packages a year, by far the most, more than FedEx, UPS, DHL combined. Again, those private carriers have to give law enforcement, including your good folks at Customs and Border Protection, the information. They can then find these packages that are suspect, where it's from, what's in it, where it's going. Post office, for the most part, doesn't have that because we do not have a requirement on them. The requirement was put in place on the other carriers right after 9/11. And the thought was that the post office would do it also because we required that they do a study of it. They said it would take them some time. It's been 16 years, and they're still studying it. So our legislation that many members of this committee have strongly supported, I see Senator Hassan here, for instance, she's been a big advocate of this, as have others, is just to say, let's make the post office also give your people what they say they need, and they've testified before us here that they need it and need it badly. Senator Carper, who was here earlier, and I conducted a year-long investigation into this issue through the Permanent Subcommittee investigations. We were able, by using some undercover folks from your department, thank you for lending them to us, to find out some really shocking news, which is that people are selling this stuff online freely, not worried about the enforcement side, and saying if you send it through the post office, it's guaranteed. If you send it through a private carrier, it's not. And bottom line is, you know, in this authorization legislation, we have some good things about helping with regard to working with the Chinese government, to information sharing. But the central issue here, the real gap in our defenses against this drug coming in is the delivery method. So I hope you'll work with us. What your people will tell you is it's like finding a needle in a haystack if you don't have this information. If you have it, at least you have a fighting chance of both stopping some of this poison from coming in, that is the most powerful, potent drug ever, 50 times more powerful than heroin, but also increasing the price of the drug just by reducing some of that supply, because one of our problems right now in my state and others is the fact that this is not only readily available, it's relatively inexpensive. You're aware about the legislation, because we talked about it, the STOP Act. You're aware of the fact that we are trying very hard to get this through the process right now, not just this committee, which has done, I think, a very good job on doing the research, but the Committee of Jurisdiction. I guess my question to you would be, are you willing to help us to get this done? And in particular, we've heard rumors that the House may move on something that is a watered-down version. They, by the way, have 270 co-sponsors of our bill, and yet the committee, their Ways and Means Committee, apparently is talking about giving the post office more time to do this, not having a requirement ultimately because there'd be no penalties associated with it. I guess I would ask you, are you willing to work with us and stick with us to ensure that we can require the post office to provide this information to your law enforcement folks so we can stop more of this deadly poison from coming in?
Yes, absolutely. You have my commitment, and I know, as you know, you have that of Commissioner McAleenan as well.
Yeah, the commissioner's been great as acting and now as commissioner. We appreciate it. Well, I thank you. We want to work with you on it. With regard to the H-2B visa program, let me just read you one email that I got this week, last week actually now, from a landscaper in Ohio. You know, I've talked briefly about this issue. He says, Rob, we've got $8,000 in revenue per day. We are not able to capture, or $250,000 a month. We will close $2 million under our budget for the year, which means we will lose close to $1 million this year. This is a small landscaper. This is just because he cannot rely on the labor force that he has relied on in the past. Can you just tell us briefly what your commitment is? You and I have talked about this with regard to the H-2B rule, getting it through 1B, and then what you think ought to be done in terms of a legislative visa cap.
Yes, the difficulty with the reg process is it's the reg process. I'll just be honest. We go as fast as we can, but the APA requires us to do certain things that takes a while. What we've tried to do is mimic the rule from last summer so that it can go as quickly as possible. The more changes, if we had made them to that underlying reg, the longer it would take. And I completely understand that time is of the essence. So what we chose to do is do something as quickly as we can under the APA. What I had mentioned to you earlier, and I mentioned earlier in testimony, was that the best way to fix this, is to take all of the information that the members have, which I'm gathering, everyone I've talked to, you as well, I said, please give me examples of companies that are going out of business because of either the problems with the seasonality or because there's not enough, to package it up, give it back, and just put it in law. That will give the companies predictability. They'll understand how many visas will be available, and they'll understand when. Right now, as you know, it's tied to the appropriations process, which it's anyone's guess when we can get that through. So it's very difficult on businesses.
Well, I would agree with your approach. My time is coming to an end, just to say that meanwhile, right now, we need relief. And then finally, with regard to unaccompanied kids, I don't have time to go into it, but we have information now from you all as of 10 days ago that on July 30, you will have a new deadline to deliver the joint concept of operations, which we really need, both for the sake of these kids not to be trafficked or abused, but also to be sure, as Senator McCaskill said, these kids actually show up at their court proceedings, and that's not happening now for a lot of kids. So the memorandum of agreement's good. We want to get this joint operations concept in place in order to ensure these kids are protected. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Senator Portman, before I go into the second round of questions, I just have I kind of want to walk through. I will, by the way, reinforce what Senator Portman talked about, the H-2B visas. There's not one manufacturing plant in Wisconsin, not one dairy farm, not one resort that can hire enough people. So that really is a pressing need, and understand the problems you have with the rules and regulations. I do want to give you the opportunity. I just put my UAC chart up there that, again, I think kind of shows that DACA sparked it. But I want you to go through 3 different examples and talk about the laws that you have to follow that, in the case of UACs, result in only 3.5% being returned, which, again, from my standpoint, when you come and you get to stay, that's a huge incentive for more to come. But I want you to cover an example of UAC. I want you family units, and then an adult that claims credible fear, all under the backdrop, according to my calculations, this is an estimate, since 2013, about 750,000 unaccompanied children and a parent and one child, in terms of numbers we have entered this country illegally, and most of them are still probably in this country. But just go through exactly what is the process. UAC show up, and let's say they do it legally.
Sure. So if a UAC, if they're unaccompanied, they come and they're put this. Okay, let me back up.
And again, I want to know the laws, the precedents that actually
Understand.
force you to do what you do.
So if they are Mexican children of Mexican origin, we can put them into expedited removal if they have no legal reason to be here. So that means they haven't claimed asylum, they don't have a legal visa, they're not part of the legal immigration system. If they are other than Mexican, which is the phrase in the law, so that's normally we talk about the Northern Triangle country, we do not put them in expedited removal. In any case, we only keep the child for 48 hours. After 48 hours, we turn them over to HHS. We now have this process by which we will help HHS vet the sponsors to help place the child in a safe place and safe care. So that's the UACs. The UACs, though, important to know that overall, under current court cases, we can only hold UACs for 20 days, which is quite a few things. It puts a lot of pressure, time pressure, on making sure that we find, as a community, a suitable sponsor. But it also serves as a tremendous pull factor because they will only be apprehended for 20 days, even if there's no valid reason to be here.
Just quick talk about the laws, the legal precedent that force you to, you've got to give, DHS has to give up an unaccompanied child within 48 hours to HHS, and then HHS can only hold it for 20 days.
Yes, so that's under the Flores settlement. It's a combination of the Flores settlement and the Trafficking Act. The Trafficking Act is in part why we give them over to HHS.
Okay, now family units.
So family units, they come if they are claiming asylum. We do all we can to keep them as a family as they go through the process. I mentioned earlier, sometimes they're detained. If we don't believe they're a risk on a case-by-case basis, we do other methods such as, we have an alternatives to detention process. The difficulty there is the backlog. So we have a 600,000 person backlog. We've had an increase of 1,700% in asylum claims over the last 10, 15 years. So what that means as they go through the system is 80% of the people coming in pass that initial credible fear, but only 20% are actually granted asylum by a judge. So our concern is that there's just a lot of fraud. It doesn't mean that you made a fraudulent claim. It could just mean that you believe that you can seek asylum, for example, for family reunification, but our laws don't allow you to seek asylum for the sole purpose of family reunification.
But of the family units that have come here since 2013, how many have been returned because they don't qualify for asylum?
Again, if they're with the children, we have to release the children. So that often means we release the parents as well. in almost
So
all
the
cases.
vast majority are still in this country?
Yes, sir.
Okay, now an adult with credible fear.
So adult with credible fear, we process, well, it's interesting. We have ongoing litigation that prevents us in some cases from detaining them. In some cases, we must let them go on parole. There are certain exceptions to that, but we do not have the ability to detain until we can process them and determine if they need to be removed. They claim asylum, they go into the asylum bucket. Again, the problem with the asylum bucket is the backlog, and it's very heavily abused by those who actually do not seek asylum, thereby putting those who need asylum in jeopardy of not receiving it in a timely manner.
Okay, thank you. Senator McCaskill.
First of all, I think you are really working hard at trying to address some of the shortcomings in terms of these children. And oversight sometimes is unpleasant. But it doesn't mean that any of us up here don't respect how difficult your job is. I am really worried about a case involving a whistleblower at TSA. And what is really upsetting to me about this particular case, as you know, there's been a lot of coverage about morale at TSA and problems of drugs and drinking and inappropriate behavior. This is an actual complaint that was investigated by the Office of the Inspector General at Homeland Security. And this activity predated you, so I want to be clear about that. But following this investigation by the IG, 4 charges were brought against an SES employee, including poor judgment for maintaining an inappropriate relationship, basically lying about an intimate and sexual relationship during the investigation, inappropriate conduct by violating hiring practices, and there's more details there, unprofessional conduct by forwarding an email to a subordinate employee in which he referred to an assistant administrator in an inappropriate language I won't use in this hearing. So what was really most concerning about this OIG report, and I've got the report here, and I'd like to make it part of the record, just so we have it, Mr. Chairman, if there's, without objection, I hope.
Without objection.
But what is really scary about this review is that they found a series of deviations from standard policy in terms of how this was handled, in allowing the employee to receive unusually favorable treatment. And as you know, one of the biggest problems you have with morale is the rules have to apply to everybody. OIG specifically identified 3 members of senior leadership at TSA that interfered with the disciplinary process in a way that promoted favoritism. This was the deputy administrator, the former assistant administrator of the Office of Professional Responsibility, and the current chief counsel. So imagine my surprise when I find out that we're working on this, and who's in charge? The chief counsel. And by the way, the table of penalties required that this SES be removed according to the table of penalties at TSA. Instead, they offered a suspension, permitted the employee to continue to receive the same salary that he was receiving. The chairman of this committee and I have sent a letter to you in February asking about what disciplinary actions have been taken against this senior leadership that interfered in a disciplinary process involving a complaint by a whistleblower that has been investigated by the IG and found to be valid. And I'm particularly worried that we've put the fox in charge of the henhouse if this chief counsel that was part of the problem is cited in this report is in fact the one that is supposedly now helping making sure this doesn't happen again. So you're welcome to take this for the record, Secretary, if you have an answer today, but this is why you have bad morale.
I would like to get into more detail either on the record, or excuse me, to take for return to get back to you. But let me just say this. Whistleblowers need to be protected, period. The IG needs to be listened to. The IG serves an extraordinarily important function, particularly at a department the size of DHS. I would say that if a policy is such that a person who is part of the complaint is then put in charge of rectifying the situation, that is wholly inappropriate, I will for sure look into that. You're right, that's not acceptable. And accountability, you've heard me say it many times before. The vast majority of people, men and women who work at DHS, are dedicated professionals. When something like this occurs, we need to all hold them accountable as a community. It's as simple and as complicated as that. It needs to be done. I'm not as familiar with the particular one, but I can guarantee you I will look into it and get back to you.
I would love that. And I should just tell you that this staff of this committee has been talking to a number of whistleblowers from the Federal Marshal Program. Did I say TSA? I didn't mean TSA. It's the Federal Marshal Program.
Oh, I see, okay.
If I said the wrong thing. These are all the air marshals. And you've got trouble there. There is inequities that are occurring, there is favoritism that's occurring, there is abusive behavior that's occurring, and we have got a string of whistleblowers that have been coming to us about various problems. So if you would get back to us specifically on this case involving an investigation by the Inspector General as it relates to the Federal Air Marshal Program, and I would like your take on, now that you've been there a short period of time, but nonetheless long enough, I would like what your view is of the Federal Air Marshal Program and whether or not it's being utilized effectively and whether or not we are putting marshals on the right flights. Are we putting marshals on too many flights? I've always questioned some of the procedures because, flying back and forth to DC on commercial airlines as often as I do, for many years it was really obvious who the marshals were. They were the two guys in jeans that got on first. And so if there was some effort to, have them intermingle and be effective at, detecting and shutting down. It was like, okay, everybody's standing in the line at Southwest. All of us, they were waiting to be herded on, standing by our stanchion. Well, there goes the marshals. They're going to load us pretty soon. And then I would say something. Have the marshals gone on yet? And everybody would look at me like I've said a dirty word. Oh, what are you talking about? Like it was some secret. So it just has always worried me that we are not staying on top of what is the most effective way for us to put security in the air. And I would love your take on that from your view as the Secretary of Homeland Security.
Yeah, I appreciate that. What we're in the process of doing with the administrator right now is actually looking at that full program. How should it work? Does it make sense? Is the modeling right? The example that you're using, is, at least as I understand it, was a procedure under the belief that deterrence was the most important. So to some extent, if the marshals were obvious as to who they were, there would be a deterrent value.
Well, shouldn't they have been in uniforms then?
So I'm not disagreeing. I'm just explaining as I understand it. But your point is valid, which is as long as we're resourcing this way, we want it to be effective. So the administrator and I are happy to come talk to you about our initial findings and what we're looking at. But yes, it needs to be looked at from soup to nuts to make sure that it's effective.
Yeah, and we'll be glad at the appropriate time to share with you some of the whistleblower investigations that are ongoing, but I would like your specific response to that IG investigation where people in the highest levels of management were skewing the process in favor of somebody that was a SES as opposed to someone who had been abused.
Senator Hassan.
Thank you very much. And again, good afternoon, Secretary. I wanted to touch on homegrown terrorism for a minute and our efforts to prevent it. According to the President's budget request, the Office of Terrorism Prevention Partnerships currently is staffed by 12 people. Its predecessor office, the Office of Community Partnerships, had 16 positions, and through a reprogramming of appropriations requested by then Secretary Johnson, was able to use support staff to build an outreach team that could build relationships with community groups, with civic leaders, and law enforcement throughout the country. According to the budget request for fiscal year 19, the Office of Terrorism Prevention Partnerships is, quote, dedicated to the mission of countering violent extremism and the building of community partnerships necessary to support countering violent extremism efforts. That's the quote. So given that the budget and personnel for this office is smaller but the overall mission is still the same. It would seem that this office would be hard-pressed to build partnerships across the country with no field staff. Has DHS budgeted for field staff for this office?
There is some field staff. I'm happy to get you the specific numbers. Just more broadly, very quickly, what we've done is we've put the office within the larger Office of Public Engagement. So we've actually force multiplied the office, if you will, to make sure that we do, as a whole group, as a whole part of DHS, look to build those community relationships.
Okay, well, I'd love to have our offices follow up and
Happy
get full
to.
information about that. And as a follow-up to that, DHS co-leads the Interagency Task Force on Countering Violent Extremism along with the Justice Department. The task force was created to help coordinate the government's ability to tackle homegrown terrorism. In 2015, this task force was staffed by representatives from 11 different departments. Can you tell me how many different federal agencies currently provide staff to this interagency task force?
I do not know the specific number, but happy to get back to you this week.
Okay, I would appreciate that greatly because obviously, especially when it comes to homegrown terrorism, the name of the game is coordination and communication among
Absolutely.
agencies and with local authorities and state authorities. I also wanted to touch on a New Hampshire-specific issue. In my state, we have a significant Indonesian community, many of whom came to New Hampshire fleeing religious persecution against Christians in Indonesia. They have become members of the community, they have worked jobs and paid taxes, and they have raised their families in the seacoast area of New Hampshire. Now, after many years of them living in this country, the Department of Homeland Security has prioritized them for deportation, a decision that could put their lives at risk if they return to a country where violence against religious minorities remains a serious issue. Last week, you publicly pledged to my fellow New Hampshire Senator Jeanne Shaheen that you'd take another look at this issue. When you went back and looked again at this issue, what did you find? Have you asked Immigration and Customs Enforcement to review and reconsider their efforts to deport members of this community?
We have asked them to review it. On the face of it, we don't have an instance, so I'd love to work with both of you to get some additional facts. We don't have an instance that they have moved in any way from prioritization. Again, our prioritization, as you know, is criminals. We don't prioritize groups, nationalities, religious groups. So yes, we're looking at it. We're particularly concerned, as you know, given the recent terrorist events in Indonesia against Christians, Catholics in a particular case. But.
And let me just be clear that these are people who regularly went in for their check-ins on a regular basis, and all of a sudden, last year, they got tickets, leave, and if it weren't for a federal district court telling your department that they could not deport these people, they would be deported. So there was and these people are not criminals, so there was some level of new prioritization there that has put this community at risk, and I think there is a strong feeling in New Hampshire, and I'm glad to hear your response that we need to get some predictability and sustainability here for these people, and they really do face persecution back home, and so we'd love to work with you on that, and it would be really good if you could make a commitment to finalize an answer on that in the near term.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Lastly, I know there's been a lot of discussion while I was at another hearing on the issue of not only unaccompanied minors, but families with minor children. I'll just add my support to the line of questioning you heard from members of the committee about our concerns about this when we had a hearing just a couple of weeks ago about the handling of minors, especially as they went to sponsors, sponsor families and the like. It was very clear that the department does not, neither DHS or HHS, they don't coordinate at all with local authorities and with the states as we look at how we're going to address the needs of children generally who come to this country and are unaccompanied or separated from their families. And I don't support the separation of these children from their families. I'll add my comments in support of what you heard from my colleagues on that issue. But if children are placed away from their families, I think it's imperative that the department and HHS work with the states. States have interstate compacts about how to protect children who aren't with their families. It's important for local school districts, for instance, to know to expect these children at school, not only for the local school district's planning purposes, but so that if these kids don't show up, there's somebody somewhere who knows that to go look for them and find out what's happened to them. So I just think, you know, to echo what you've heard from both sides of the aisle this afternoon, we need to see planning and we need to see a better system for addressing the needs of children who come to this country. Thank you.
Senator Harris.
Thank you. Secretary Nielsen, how many children have been separated from their parents at ports of entry since January of 2017?
So I understand you referenced 700 before, which I believe was an HHS number. Our figures are not the same as theirs, but we're happy to come give you our numbers and explain why they differ.
Okay, great. And can you submit that by the end of next week with the other information? And do you know?
Could you share that with the committee? I think that's something.
Of course.
If you guys have different numbers of children, that's something that just on its face is rather alarming.
Yeah.
So I'd
Yeah.
like to figure
It's,
out why.
Yes, I think it's in part because when HHS does the interview, they don't ask the child why they are unaccompanied. So their numbers are different than ours if you're asking at the border, for example. So it's not necessarily that they conflict, it's just they're asking different questions. But yes, of course, we'll provide you the information
Thanks.
explaining you that.
Okay, and again, I've asked these questions of Undersecretary McCammett before, so perhaps everyone's working on it, and I would expect that we should get it by the end of next week. And can you also give us information about what the average length of separation has been between those children and their parents? And that would be that number that you are now going to bring to us.
Okay.
And also what timelines in terms of the policy that you have exists to establish a parental relationship or to reunify families. I'm hoping and will assume that your protocols would have such a goal in mind, or at least a time frame.
Yes, ma'am, they do. Part of it is a voluntary DNA test if it's a family member. The concern that I have with that, and we do offer that, but the concern, of course, is you could still have a custodial relationship and not be a blood relative. So it's not dispositive to an appropriate custodian. But yes, of course, that is our goal.
And then as it relates to the number of children who have been separated from their parents at points of entry, again, I would like also for the committee information on how many of those cases resulted in trafficking charges. Regarding detention conditions, Secretary, are you aware that multiple federal oversight bodies, such as the OIG and the GAO, have documented medical negligence of immigrants in the detention system, in particular, that ICE has reported 170 deaths in their custody since 2003? Are you familiar with that?
No, ma'am.
Are you aware that they also found that pregnant women in particular receive insufficient medical attention while in custody, resulting in dehydration and even miscarriages?
I do not believe that is a current assessment of our detention facilities.
Okay, can you please submit to this committee a current assessment?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So
On
we
that point.
provide neonatal care. We do pregnancy screening from ages 15 to 56. We provide outside specialists should you seek it. We do not detain any women past their third trimester or once they enter their third trimester. We provide them separate housing. So yes, we're happy to detail all of the things we do to take good care of them.
And did you submit that to the OIG in response to their findings?
We have been yes, of course, working in conjunction with the OIG. I'm not sure exactly what the date is of the OIG report that you're referencing, but I will look into it after this.
And then also between fiscal year 12 and March of 2018, it's our understanding, before I go on, the OIG report is from December of this past year, 2017, so it's very recent, 5 months ago. Also, between FY12 and March 2018, ICE received, according to these reports, 1,448 allegations of sexual abuse in detention facilities, and only a small percent of these claims have been investigated by DHS. OIG, are you familiar with that?
I'm not familiar with that number, no.
Okay, can you please provide to this committee an analysis of what is going on and what plan you have to investigate those cases of sexual abuse, and what is the protocol in place in terms of what is being done to allow the victim to be in a safe place during and pending any investigation? What kind of services are these victims getting in terms of treating their trauma, much less any medical attention they may need as a result of what might be the sexual abuse?
I will. What I have done is I've talked to the International Committee of the Red Cross, and I had them visit some of our detention facilities. I'm sure they would be happy to come brief you on that, but their determination is that they saw nothing but appropriate detention, and in fact, much better detention than they, in their experience, have seen in other areas.
I'm sorry, is this in response to the concern that you have received 1,400
No, ma'am.
48 allegations of sexual abuse in detention facilities?
No, ma'am. This is in response to my wanting to ensure that the detention centers are taking appropriate care of anybody who is detained.
Okay, well, obviously, sexual abuse would not fall in that category.
It would not. I guess
Yeah.
what I'm saying is that just happened. I don't know when these results are that you're talking about, so I will look into them, of course.
FY12 through March of 2018, this year.
We will look into it.
Thank you. And regarding your treatment in the facilities of pregnant women, on December 14, again, in this report, ICE issued a new directive that terminated a previous policy of presumptive release for pregnant women, which were apprehended or transferred to ICE. ICE adopted a policy for presumption of release in August of 2016 in recognition of the clear health risks that detaining pregnant women in jail-like conditions pose. I was alarmed, frankly, Secretary, by your statement to Senator Murray before the Senate Appropriations Committee last Tuesday that pregnant women in ICE detention were receiving, quote, much better care than when they're living in the shadows. So are you aware that this statement contradicts the views of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the American Academy of Family Physicians, and the American Academy of Pediatricians, who have all criticized the harmful effects of immigration detention on the medical and mental health of pregnant women?
What I do know is that if you cross between points of entry, you will be detained and prosecuted. I also know that of the only 35 people that we have currently in detention who are pregnant, 33 are statutorily required to be detained. I also know that we go above and beyond to provide them adequate health care. The questioning was whether or not they received adequate health care. I was saying, yes, they do, and it's paid for. So if they are coming here and they're fleeing persecution and they don't have adequate funds and they're trying to get equivalent care in the shadows, it was my discussion that we were providing care within the detention centers.
So is it your intention to continue with ending a program that allowed for presumptive release for pregnant women?
If you're in your third trimester, you will be released, but if you break the law, you will be detained.
So when in the third trimester exactly? How many
When
weeks?
it begins, when it begins.
At the beginning of the third trimester?
Yes, ma'am.
And is there a directive that has gone out?
Yes.
Okay, will you supply the committee, please, with a copy
Yes,
of that?
it's the same policy we've always had. The only thing we're doing now is we are no longer exempting classes of people from the law. If you break the law, you will be prosecuted.
Thank you.
As long as we're talking about UACs still, and you're going to be providing some data, I've just got a couple requests. In terms of family units, best numbers I can come up with since 2013, about 225,000 family units. If you just take the minimum, one child, that's basically 450,000 additional individuals. If you're saying about 700 we've seen separations of parent from, is that from that 2013 or is that just currently in detention?
I believe the HHS number was a year-long number.
Okay. So again, I'd kind of just like all that data together. As long as you're also providing that, I'd like to know, which of those separations are due because you simply aren't aware. Is that really the parent? There's some question, so you're really taking that step to protect the child so we're not dealing with the human trafficking situation. We had a whistleblower in May of 2017 referred to, I think it was in 2014, 18 self-admitted MS-13 members were apprehended and just released. At that PSI hearing, I brought some more information. I don't have it right here, but it's actually a rather alarming number of MS-13 members that have been captured, and some of them have been deported. Do you have, DHS, are you keeping more accurate figures on MS-13?
Yes, we are in conjunction with the Department of Justice. One of the other loopholes, though, I would just mention quickly is a court case called Zavados. Zavados requires us to release criminal aliens back into the communities after 6 months if their country is not willing to take them back. Many countries, such as China, Cuba, not willing to take them back. The criminals go back into the community. It's 1,700 released last year.
Okay, I was going to, just, so that was last year. Do you have that information going back a number of years?
Happy to.
Okay, I'd like that type of data. Working on the piece of legislation in terms of authorities on unidentified aircraft systems, this is a really complex issue. It really is. I guess I'd just kind of like to give you the ability to just kind of describe the complexity of it, where you are constrained. I mean, I think we are so far behind the curve on this thing as these drones have become far more prevalent and are a real danger, and they're being used in the battlefield, and they're dropping. Again, I really don't want to put any ideas in people's head, but can you just talk about what you want to do in working with DHS? I was trying to at least get into discussion kind of a more robust response. And again, I realize there's jurisdictional issues, that type of thing. But I just want to have you talk a little bit more of the complexities of the issue and baseline what you're asking for in terms of authority, what you absolutely need.
Sure. So right now, we do not have the ability to interdict or monitor, or actually in some cases identify in a traditional sense. The Department of Defense has such authority, so what we've done is we've mimicked our request, and then the bill this committee's introduced. Oh, go ahead.
So real quick, what is the department, name the facilities the Department of Defense has. Is this just around their facilities? I mean, how limited is
Theirs is limited as well, yes. So I wouldn't say all of their, I defer to Department of Defense, of course, but it doesn't cover all of their facilities. So it's very specific in limited cases, yes.
So we have sports stadiums and we have a number of venues that simply there's no authority whatsoever. Not local, not state, not federal.
Correct.
Okay.
So it's soft targets is a big concern, and then, of course, the border. So we're already seeing them being used. I also don't want to put any ideas in people's minds, but we already see them being used in nefarious ways on the border.
And the Department of Energy has some authorities as well?
Department of Energy does. DHS and DOJ are the two departments that are currently lacking any authority. In terms of what we're doing, you're right. We have, because we lack authority, we have limitations on testing. We have limitations on research and development. We have limitations on purchasing and using. The authority that would be in the bill that you both have introduced would go a very long way in helping us to get on top of this threat.
Want to continue to work with you. I think this is absolutely crucial.
I just need to correct something for the record. In the section of my book, I had a whole section on the morale and whistleblower issues at the Federal Marshal's Program. Then I had a separate section on the IG report where there was problems with an SES employee that was manipulated by senior management. That was TSA.
Okay, thank you.
So I wanted to make sure we didn't
appreciate
close the hearing without me explaining that I got them conflated as we were talking about. I wanted to clarify that before we closed out the hearing.
Not a problem. Let's quick turn to election security. We've held a briefing on this. We've certainly talked about this in other venues during other hearings as well. From my standpoint, there are three areas that are at risk. It's affecting the voter tally, I mean the actual vote. Then you also have affecting the voter file. And then finally, just because of the disruption, the public not having faith that it was a legitimate election. It's my understanding, first of all, that the department has all the authorities you believe you need to address all three. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Voter tallies, because election machines are not tied into the internet, although there are some with Wi-Fi that are disabled, but.
Right, our best practice that we recommend is do not connect to the internet.
And they really aren't, unless it's done through nefarious means or something, correct?
Yes.
So it'd be really very difficult to change the vote tally for an outside actor through a cyber attack or something to actually change the vote tally. Is that your understanding?
That is my understanding. I think what is more likely is the counter-influence question. Would they change the minds of Americans through propaganda and et cetera? So that's something the FBI has lead on. We're working
That'd be the Facebook where they're,
Yep. Yes, sir.
Okay, basically illegally campaigning. Voter files, that's a concern, but again, we have different controls and things in place that we know that. It'd be disruptive in an election, and then that would turn into, is this a legitimate election?
What we recommend there is redundancy. So if you don't use a paper ballot, then make sure that you have an audit function. So at the end of the day, we can all assure ourselves that Americans have voted and their vote counts and is counted correctly.
One of the reasons I'm pointing this out, and then I'll be finished, is I think that the biggest threat really is just the public perception, is this a legitimate election? And if we overstate the ability of a bad actor to affect the voter file or the vote tally, we actually do the malign actor's job for them. So I think it's very important that we are very honest in terms of what is the threat in terms of the first two, so we don't affect the third.
Sir, I agree with that. What we're doing at DHS is, the responsibility first and foremost belongs to state and local election officials. We're working with them. We're hosting a meeting for all members of Congress. I understand the Senate might not be able to attend on Thursday, but to answer any questions, talk about what DHS is doing, talk about the threat. We'll do it again for the Senate. I think it's very important that everyone understands what we are doing, but also what the states are doing and what, in some cases, they need to do to make sure that they assure their public that they're doing everything they can.
But again, you believe you have the authorities and resources
We have all the
to
authorities we
counter
need,
this?
yes.
Senator McCaskill, you have any further questions?
Call me secretary?
No, I didn't finish it.
I appreciate Secretary being here.
Well, then we'll close out the hearing. Secretary Nielsen, again, thank you for your service. Certainly appreciate your taking the time here and your forthright answers to our questions. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days until May 30th at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.
White House policy to manage the hearing.